Well, greetings to all of you. Shabbat Shalom. Today is the 25th day of the Omer. That's 3 weeks and 4 days of the Omer. That's halfway to Shavuot, halfway to Pentecost. That is amazing how fast time travels. So we are to be considering as we recount and number each day, as it instructs us to, not to count like 1, 2, 3, 4, but to recall, to recount, as the Hebrew means. To recount means to remember, to story, to tell it. As you count it, is to accompany the telling, the recall of the journey of Israel out of Egypt toward Sinai, towards the presence of God and His Torah when His law was given on that special blessed day. But it's also to remind us of our journey as we march out of Egypt towards the promised land, towards God, towards the living Torah, Yeshua, in our hearts, and as we march towards Pentecost and the giving of the Holy Spirit on that day, Shavuot. Today I'm going to continue. I haven't been visiting. I've been sidetracked, well, not sidetracked, but definitely focusing on the high days. You know, we had Pesach and the Festival of Matzah and such coming. I'd like to get back to our march through the book of Exodus. Last time we finished in Exodus, I was in chapter 22, in Exodus chapter 22, and I'd like to pick it up there. I think I'll just kind of skip a little bit and kind of try to get the feel for where we were at the end of chapter 21. So Exodus 21. Again, in verse 30, it talks about if there's imposed upon him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life whatever is imposed upon him. This is in the context of if two men were to fight together and an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It says in Exodus 21 and verse 24, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and hand for hand and foot for foot. And people I've heard say, like I heard a famous radio talk show host, I don't need to mention his name, but he was talking about, in Iran they have this law that's just like the biblical law, and if you're caught stealing, they'll cut your hand off, just like the Hebrews did. It just shows the ignorance of people concerning the history of Israel and the culture and what the Bible actually says, hand for hand, an eye for an eye. And it's just sad that people would compare the law, the Torah, to Sharia law. I find that very personally disturbing. I do not believe it's a fair comparison. At any rate, it talks about if there is imposed upon him a sum of money, then he would pay to redeem his life. So the eye for an eye was talking about equality, not that, they were doing something and they were fighting and this guy's eye got gouged out or damaged or something, and let's hold this other guy down and gouge his eye out with a stick. He'd probably die from an infection. It wouldn't be an eye for an eye. It'd be an eye for a life. And they didn't cut people's hands off. It was equality. And so it's clarifying it here in verse 30. If there's imposed upon him a sum of money, then he would pay to redeem his life. Life for a life, well, then it could be a sum of money that he might have to spend quite a few years indebted to pay that back. And there were certain penalties that you could not redeem your life for, but that would be a whole study into the statutes, for murder and things like that. But they could not pay to redeem their life. But if two men were fighting and somebody was killed accidentally, then they could pay to redeem their life if it was not intentional, premeditated murder. So I just wanted to introduce that and remind everybody in verse 30 that he could pay to redeem his life whatever is imposed upon him by the judges, according as the judges would determine. So then it talks about, in the context also, if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox would be stoned, etc. And the owner of the ox, if it had been known to have gored in times past, then he would have a portion of money that he would have to pay. So, again, if two men fight together, he would have to pay as the judges determine. Notice that in verse 22. If men fight together and hurt a woman with a child so that she gives birth prematurely, then he would be punished according to as the woman husband imposes upon him. He shall pay financial compensation. It wasn't that he would be killed. He would pay as the judges would determine. So that is the context again, and it says again pay in verse 30. Now we'll continue down from there. Rather, if the ox has gored, verse 32, a manservant or a maidservant, he shall give to the master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox would be stoned. If a man opens a pit or digs a pit and doesn't cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in it, the owner of the pit would make it good. So if you dig a hole out on your property, I don't know, today maybe somebody comes in with a backhoe and they dig a test hole on their land to see if they can put a drain field there or something, some reason that you would have a big hole and you don't leave it covered. And if a neighbor's dog falls in that pit and can't get back out and dies, you have liability. God forbid that it would be a child that would fall in and die. Then you would have incredible liability. So we are to not just consider our own, well, it's my land, I can do whatever I want on your land. Well, yes, it is your land. You can do whatever you want on your land, and it's God's law, and he can impose whatever penalty he wants for what you do on your land. And this is God's law. So if somebody wanders onto your land, you have a responsibility if you have a staircase and you don't have hand railing. If you dig a hole and you don't cover it up. So, etc. God's law is love. It's how you show love to your neighbor. These are good and just statutes the Eternal gives us. Verse 35, if one man's ox hurts another man's ox so that it dies, they would sell the live ox and divide the money, and the dead ox they would also divide. If it was known that the ox tended to thrust in time past, the owner has not kept it confined. So this is concerning, let's say you had open range territory, and you have an ox that is known to be kind of mean. Then you're responsible to take it out of the open range territory where it could mingle with other people's livestock. They would brand their livestock or tag them and somehow identify them. So that they could tell whose was whose. But if you have a mean cow or a donkey that's known to kick, or a dog that roams the neighborhood starting fights with other dogs or biting people, and you know it, but you don't confine your dog, and you say, well, it's my property, and some little boy comes wandering onto your property and the dog bites him, you have violated Torah. That's how God sees it. These are God's laws. If you know your dog bites, some breeds have a tendency to bite, and you decide, I want to get one of these breeds that has a tendency to bite. We all know that certain breeds are meaner than others, and you choose to get that kind of a dog, and it's known that that breed is dangerous. That right there should give you certain pause. There is responsibility that comes with that kind of thing. So these are God's laws, and he talks about an ox, what God's supposed to do. Mention every animal, an elephant, a camel, a horse, a donkey, an ox, a dog, etc. So he gives the principle, and the spirit of God's law continues and applies in various ways. You could even apply it to things that are not necessarily related to an animal. If you have a piece of machinery and this piece of machinery, sometimes, this chain flies off, and, if somebody's standing there and it hits them and you don't put a guard on it, the principle of God's law stands, and the judges would impose a penalty accordingly. This is God's Torah. Chapter 22, continuing, Exodus 22 and verse 1. If a man steals an ox or a sheep, and he slaughters it or he sells it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. You might think, well, why not 5 and 5? Why would it be different for a sheep than it was for an ox? Well, because the sheep was a matter of food, and I guess they would use also for the, wool. An ox was not only, could be a meat source and not only a revenue source that you could breed cattle and have that be a rancher, but it also was a means for a man to plow his field. It was a business, not just to provide food, but it was a business to plow your field. It was more useful than the sheep, had higher value than the sheep, was more important to a man's survival back in the agricultural times than a sheep was, and so the penalty was higher. Now you'll notice there are different penalties for things, but you would then apply that same principle than if somebody stole, say, a luxury item or something like that, as compared to if somebody stole a man's tools that he made a living with, then how you would apply the law concerning what his penalty would be. The spirit of that principle is applied here, and the judges would impose it as the judges would study Torah and make the determination. It wasn't up to each individual to decide, but the experts in Torah are the scribes, those responsible in the service of the ministry, who know Torah. Unfortunately, the ministry of most churches do not know Torah at all. And though they claim to keep God's law, to them that's the Ten Commandments, and that is it. We haven't even read one of the Ten Commandments yet. As a matter of fact, the Ten Commandments, as precious and important as they are subject to the statutes. They depend upon the statutes. People don't realize that. We get that teaching directly from Yeshua, the living Torah himself. Yeshua spoke. They asked him, which is the greatest commandment of all? In Matthew, I think, is it chapter 22, you can read. Which is the greatest commandment of all? And Messiah said, you shall love the eternal your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul. Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel, the eternal, our God. The eternal is one. Yahweh Echad. One. He is the most important. You shall love him with your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. That is the most important commandment. You shall inscribe it on the doorposts of your house. It's so important. Put it upon the gates of your property. It's so important. Bind it as a sign upon your hand that shall be as frontlets between your eyes, because it's so important. And the second is like unto it. It's just as important, in other words. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Then Messiah said, upon these two statutes, they were not part of the 10, those are both statutes. Upon those two statutes depend or hang all of Torah, all of the words of the prophets, every law, including the 10, they depend from those statutes. You cannot say, well, we keep the 10, but the statutes we don't keep, because they depend upon the statutes. Loving God with all of your heart being the greatest commandment of all, and the second greatest being loving your neighbor who is made in God's image. So they are very precious, very important, and you don't want to judging who does not keep the statutes. I'm just going to sidetrack just for a moment. Please keep this in mind, because it's so important, especially for churches, right? Keep this in mind. In Isaiah chapter 8, in verse 16, God spoke through the prophet Isaiah and said, bind up the testimonies. God's testimonies, right? It says in the book of Revelation that the testimony of Yeshua is a spirit of prophecy. So a testimony is not a prophecy, but it's kind of like a prophecy. A prophecy is a specific thing. There was Samuel came and told Saul, this is what's going to happen. After this, you're going to walk down here and you're going to meet some people, and they're going to be looking for their donkeys or lost donkeys, and you're going to tell them where they are, and there's somebody else, and they're going to have bread, and you're going to prophesy. And all these things, he gave them specific details of what was going to happen. And those were prophecies that were detail-oriented, specific things. Now, what's the difference between a prophecy and a testimony? A testimony is a principle. It's a prophetic principle. Here is a testimony. Messiah said, remember Lot's wife. Now, that is prophetic in nature, that here you have at a time when God is coming down to punish a nation, to punish peoples for their sins, yet you had a man who was righteous, and God stepped in to save him and to save his family as well. That is a testimony. It's a prophetic principle of the way God is. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, God said, here's a testimony. God said, remember, everybody who worshiped Baal at Peor is dead. That is a testimony. But all of those among you who held fast to the eternal your God are alive and well today. That is a testimony. It's a principle. We can remember these principles or testimonies. So bind these testimonies up, the testimonies of Torah, the testimonies that are in Tanakh, the Old Testament. Bind them up. Hold on to them. They shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, and don't let them go. Don't let anybody tell you that you don't need Torah. That's done away with and that kind of rubbish. When Messiah said, don't think I came to destroy Torah. I did not. I came to fulfill it. Not even the slightest jot or tittle will pass from Torah or any of Tanakh until all the world, heaven and earth, will pass away first. Well, the earth is still here. Don't listen to preachers who tell you otherwise. Now continue as in Isaiah. Seal up among my disciples the testimony, or bind up the testimony, like a sign on your hand. Bind it to your hand. That's why the Jews take the phylacteries or the tefillin and they wrap it up and they bind it to their hand and then they pray. Make fun of it if you want. I would not. It says, seal Torah among my disciples. The word in the English translation is law, but law says, well, the Ten Commandments are the law, thou shalt is law, but sealing Torah, now that means not only the statutes, but it also means the judgments. Not only the judgments, it means the testimonies. Not only the testimonies, it means the promises, the covenants, all those loving covenants, including the covenants that God gave to Abraham before Abraham was circumcised, which is symbolic. Those covenants and the promise of the coming Messiah, etc. Seal Torah among my disciples. I will wait on Yahweh. Skipping down here for time's sake. Don't listen to wizards and mediums, verse 19. And verse 20 it says, to Torah and to the testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, it's because there is no light in them. True teachers of God are going to speak according to Torah and according to the testimonies. That is what God said. If they do not speak according to Torah and the testimonies, you don't want them judging you. You don't want them in a position over you telling you this is the... When we read the law about how do you do this, how do you do that, they don't know it. Those who do deserve respect. Those who don't, there's no light in them. Doesn't mean that they deserve disrespect. They should be loved, respected, but not followed. There's no light in them. When the blind lead the blind, both fall into the ditch. There is no light in them. How many people believe that? How many people believe what God said? God said, for all the things I've done, and yet you do not believe me. And so I ask, do you believe God? Do you believe that there is no light in those who do not bind or hold fast to the truth of God in Torah? They do not apply or listen or pay attention to the testimonies. It's like they don't even know what a testimony is. That means there's no light in them. Sorry, it doesn't mean they're bad people. They're probably millions of beautiful, wonderful people. There's no light in them. There's no light in them. Not a little, no light in them. That's what the Bible says. So when you're talking about the statutes, that is important to keep in mind. It is the light of God. You know, we sing a song, walking in the light of God. That means the presence of God, because they followed God out of Egypt. There was a light, a fire that lit up the sky at night, and a pillar of a cloud in the day, and they were baptized into it. And they followed it out of Egypt and followed it into the promised land. Continuing then where we were here in Exodus chapter 22. So we finished chapter 21. It was known in the past that this ox had been, he should have confined it. If he didn't, then he would pay ox for ox, and the dead ox would be his own. You could apply that dog for dog, or etc. Now, in chapter 22, we'll continue. If a man steals an ox, or he steals a sheep, or he slaughters it, or sells it, he would restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If the thief is found breaking in, and he is struck so that he dies, there will be no guilt for his bloodshed. That's God's law. Now, if the sun has risen on him, there will be guilt for his bloodshed. Well, what this means is if the sun has risen upon him, in other words, if it's daylight, it's clear, this guy's out here in broad daylight doing this, it's obvious that he's not trying to sneak in and threaten your family. There's not danger involved. Many examples could be, like I remember times when my children maybe would come to my home and I'm not here and they need to get in and they're trying to break in, or maybe a friend, or perhaps you might see a neighbor and you see water coming out and you can see there's a flood going on. There's some reason you want to get in there. It's not to do harm. It's daytime. You're not trying to sneak in and steal. But if it's clear, it's obvious the intent is that there is no intention of a threat, then you can't claim you can't claim this statute and claim innocence. If it's dark or if he has a threatening intent, that is different. There would be guilt for his bloodshed otherwise. But if it was at night, there was no guilt. Other rabbis translate this I don't even want to get into that right now. If the sun has risen on him, there will be guilt for his bloodshed. He shall make full restitution. That is, the thief would still have to make restitution. If he has nothing, then he would be sold for his theft. So today what they do is they just lock people up. That means the person that had harm done, that's too bad. Harm was done to you, you don't get it paid back. Instead, society has to pay money to lock these people up and to feed them and to educate them while they're in prison and entertain them and etc. It doesn't rehabilitate the thief. It doesn't help the victim. God's law, on the other hand, says, okay, they would have to pay you 5 times as much if it was something an ox or something you could use in your business or at least 4 times as much. So you're going to get restored. And the person, while they're working it off, is learning the lesson. This is not the way to go. This doesn't pay. If they're being rehabilitated. God's law is way more loving than man's law. If he has nothing to pay it back, then he would be sold for his theft. He would be sold into slavery until he pays it off. And when you're sold into slavery, under that circumstance, to pay it off, you were not allowed out at the 7th year of release. That was only for if you had to indenture yourself in order to get out of debt, but not for theft. For theft, they had to continue to work it off. You would be rehabilitated when it was done. If the theft is certainly found alive in his hand, maybe he steals an ox, whether it's a donkey or a sheep, he would restore double. Well, then, that's interesting. He said, now it's double, and then for a sheep it's 4, but for an ox it's 5. The principle is the penalty for sin grows. Consider this. The penalties for sin grow with time. If you're found in the act trying to steal, the price is double whatever you were trying to take. Whatever the judges do, of course you're going to claim, I was only going to take that one little thing. But whatever the judges determine you were trying to steal, you would have to pay double. If it's in your hand, it's clear, these are the things you're hauling out, what have you. You would have to pay double. Why double? But later on, if you're caught with them after the fact, you're trying to sell them or you're slaughtered and you're eating or what have you, then it's 4-fold or 5-fold. Well, here's the principle. When you steal, if you have time to say, this isn't who I want to be as a person. I need to restore this. You restore it, the price is only double. But if you continue down that path, the price increases. Now, it could even double again or multiply by 5 again. Consider this. a person steals an ox. Say the value of the ox is $1,000. I'm just going to make a number. Let's say he steals an ox and the value of the ox is $1,000. Caught in the act, $2,000 penalty. You get away with it, and later on you're trying to sell the ox at auction, $5,000 penalty. You're found guilty, $5,000. The judges say, give this man $5,000. And you say, no, you flee the country and you leave. Now you have stolen $5,000 that he has rightfully coming from him. Now that $5,000 penalty, and you're stealing it and you're trying to flee from that, just got multiplied by 5, and now it's $25,000. The price of sin continues to increase until repentance and acknowledgement. It's an interesting principle to consider. It applies to many things. Exodus 22 and verse 5, if a man causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed, and he lets loose his animal, and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field. You don't just replace it, you replace it with something that is the best that you have. The best of his own vineyard. If a fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that stacked grain or standing grain or the field is consumed, then he who kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. The principle is that he would make restitution and add 20%. You can go to Leviticus chapter 6. Maybe we'll just do that. Leviticus chapter 6 and see, because you have to take all of Torah together, not just one thing by itself. There's further information here. Leviticus chapter 6 and verse 1 says, the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, if a person sins and commits a trespass against the Eternal by lying to his neighbor about what was delivered to him, or safekeeping, or about a pledge, or a robbery, or extortion, if he has found what was lost and lies concerning it, you found a nice coat, wow, that's sweet, oh yeah, it's my coat. You're lying about something that you found lost and found instead of returning it, or swears falsely, or any one of these things that a man can do in which he sins. Any of these kinds of things, it shall be because he has sinned and he is guilty. He would restore what was stolen, or the thing which was deceitfully obtained, or what was delivered to him for safekeeping, and he didn't take care of it properly, or the lost thing which he found, or all about that which he has sworn falsely. He would restore its full value and add 1/5 more to it, and give it to whomever it belongs on the day of his trespass offering. He would add 1/5 to it. So there are different judgments, and these are what we're reading now. These are judgments. That's the difference. A statute says, rise before the hoary head. A judgment says, this is the penalty for stealing. The statute says, thou shalt not steal. The judgment is the penalty for stealing. He shall bring his trespass offering to the Eternal, a ram without blemish from the flock, with the valuation, that is, with the 20%, as a trespass offering. So he restore 120%. Restore the full value plus 1/5. So if fire breaks out, if you cause a fire, and the fire comes and burns your neighbor's barn down, and it cost $50,000 to restore the man's barn and his field, then your responsibility is to pay him $50,000 plus 20%, which would be another $10,000. Did you know that? That is God's law. If a man delivers to his neighbor's money, verse 7, Exodus 22:7, or articles to keep, and it is stolen out of the man's house, if the thief is found, he would pay double. If the thief is not found, then the master of the house would be brought to the judges to see whether he has put his hand into his neighbor's goods. Sometimes you ask somebody, hey, can you keep this for me for a while? Or somebody's staying with you and then they move out, but maybe they leave some of their things there. Yeah, leave them here. And then when you get yourself settled, you can come get them. And then all of a sudden they come to get their stuff and something's missing. Hey, I've seen that happen. Or people claim, well, I'm sure I left it there. No, I brought it, honey. Did you? I didn't bring it, honey. Did you? No, I didn't get it. Well, we must have left it there. And then all of a sudden there's an accusation. So they must have taken my stuff. Oh, no, you took that when you moved. No, we didn't. Yes, you did. No, we didn't. Yes, you did. No, we didn't. Yes, you did. But there's no evidence. So if the thief is not found, you have no evidence, you have no proof, you have no witnesses, then the master of the house would be brought to the judges. Somebody who knows Torah, hopefully, right? Somebody who's not going to say, well, this is my opinion. Rather than saying, what does God say? What is God's opinion? That's what I'm interested in. I want to know God's opinion. I'm really not interested in my opinion. I'm certainly not interested in your opinion. Sorry, just not. I am interested in God's opinion. I love people. I like opinions. I like your opinion, but it's like when it comes to judgment, it's not helpful. My opinion is not helpful. God's opinion is what matters. So the master of the house would be brought to the judges, somebody who's knowledgeable in Torah, to judge according to the words of the Eternal, to see whether he has put his hand into his neighbor's goods. For any kind of trespass, whether it concerns an ox or a donkey, or whether it concerns sheep, or could be clothing, or any kind of a lost thing, could be a piece of machinery, could be whatever, family jewelry, which another claims to be his, the cause of both parties would come before the judges, plural. Remember what Messiah said, when 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, and in the Greek, the verbiage is for the purpose of judgment. It's very clear in the Greek. It's lost in the English translation in most of translations, unfortunately. But judges, plural, right? 2 or more judges would be gathered. The judges, whomever the judges condemn, shall pay double to his neighbor. So the judges would make a decision according to the words of Torah. If a man delivers to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or a sheep or any beast to keep, and it dies or it's hurt or it's driven away, no one sees it, then, there's the accusation. The judges would have to make a decision, and then there would be an oath to the Eternal, would be between them both, that he has not put his hand into his neighbor's good. I'm telling you, as an oath before God, I did not take your stuff. Then the owner would accept it. And if the judges say there's no evidence, we're not going to condemn him, then they would take the oath, and it's between him and God. And then you're obliged to accept it. I've had to do this before. Unfortunately, it's just never a fun thing to do. I had no evidence. I could not presume any guilt on anyone. And so we made an oath between the Lord and the parties. Sometimes accept it, and unfortunately, sometimes they just get angry and bitter and leave, and you never see them again. But you know what? That's really, frankly, a pathetic attitude, because this is what God says to do. You don't want to follow God? You just want to get mad and go away? I'm taking my ball and my bat and leave then? That's really pathetic. But it's because we're not learning to live according to the words of God. It's not being taught. I'm one of the few Torah teachers around anymore, unfortunately. It's the truth. We'll continue here. But, verse 12, if in fact it is stolen from him, then he shall make restitution to the owner of it. If it is stolen, he would make restitution. He would pay the double. If it's torn in pieces, maybe it's an animal, that he would bring the evidence. Maybe here's the hide, here's what's left of it. And you show you the evidence. Or show, look, I can show you the damage to my barn where the stuff was stored. They broke this door off, and I already called the police or whatever. You show the evidence to justify your case, if you can. If there isn't anything, then you have to just make an oath before the Lord. And the judges have to make a decision. If the owner was with it, well, continue. Verse 14. Exodus 22:14. If a man borrows anything from his neighbor, and it becomes injured, the Hebrew is injured, it makes you think it has to be an animal, but the Hebrew is injured as a poor translation. The Hebrew is sabiar. It means to something that is broken, shattered, or that breaks down. So it could be like an animal's leg got broken. So it could apply to an animal, but it certainly applies to machinery. Like if you borrow somebody's truck and it breaks down while you're borrowing it. I got to move next weekend. I need to move some stuff. Can I borrow your truck? That is so common. Oh, yeah, I got a truck. You can borrow it. Oh, man, the transmission went out. Man, that's $4,000. You know, here's your broken truck back. Wait a second now. It was good when I loaned it to you. Yeah, but I know this thing has 180,000 miles on it. It was ready to go anyway. We all know that. Whatever. That is not what the Bible says. The Bible says if you borrow it and it was working, if you knew there was like, hey, be careful, that thing's on its last leg, and you know it, okay, but you can't just say, here you go. If you don't like that, don't borrow it. That's what God says. If you don't like it, don't borrow it. It's the principles. You want to borrow somebody's tractor and you break the tractor or it breaks down while you got it. You got to replace it or repair it back to the original condition that it was. And if you're not happy with that judgment, then do not borrow it. If you borrow a kitchen knife, if you know of your child, I remember teaching my children when they were just little toddlers, not much bigger than my beautiful little grandjoys now, my little grandchildren. And I remember sometimes they'd borrow their friend's dolly, and while they're playing with it, this or that, and I'm like, the head broke off. Like, here's your dolly with the head broken off. And I was like, no, that's not acceptable. You've got to replace that dolly. Well, this is a Baby Secrets doll or whatever the name of the doll was, and it's cost $9.99 at Fred Meyer. Okay, so I would give my kids a job so they could do some work around the house and earn the $9.99 so they could go down to Fred Meyer and buy this doll and replace it. You shall speak about them to your children when you rise in the morning, as you go about your days doing your things, and when you lie down at night. You shall be careful to teach them my statutes. As a matter of fact, in Malachi chapter 4, it says, remember the statutes of my Moses, my servant. Statutes and testimonies. Doesn't say anything about the 10. Of course it's included. But it specifically does say the statutes and the testimonies. Remember it. Otherwise, God says he will come back and strike the earth with utter destruction. But if you do, he says, what will it do? It will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their father, certainly to their physical fathers, which is good, builds the family unit. Teaching your children the statutes and judgments is the greatest way to build a family unit, to teach respect for the mother and the father, and to turn the children to you and to help turn your hearts to them as you take time and teach them. I taught my children at home, and I taught them the statutes as part of their homeschooling. But you can do it other ways. Just do it. Just do it. And grandparents are commanded to teach their grandchildren as well. Very, very clear. And it says in Malachi, if you do this, it will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, the children to the fathers. But it's in the Hebrew, it's also, it applies to the father, but the Hebrew is singular. It really means the Father Most High. It will turn the hearts of the nation, the people, the children of God, their heart will be turned to the Most High. And his heart will be turned to them. If you teach them the statutes, save their lives from a lot of grief, a lot of sorrow, so they can be saved by grace. Of course we're saved by grace. We cannot obey ourselves into the kingdom. But we can sure have a really messed up hard life because we don't know the statutes and the testimonies. And so we can just be cursed and suffer a lot of penalties unnecessarily. Remember the statutes and testimonies that I commanded Moshe, God says. Malachi chapter 4. Right before the return of Messiah. Right before the return of Messiah. Right up until days like right now. And he's saying, remember it. Remember it. right before the turn of Hamashiach. Remember the testimonies. Remember the statutes. Teach them to your children. Exodus 22:14, if a man borrows anything then, and it breaks, and the owner was not with it, he shall surely make it good. Doesn't matter what it is. If you cannot afford to replace it, maybe you should not borrow it. Remember the example, and the man was with Elisha, and they borrowed an axe to split wood to heat their home. And the man split the axe, and the axe head was using the axe, and the axe head flew off and went into the pond or the lake. And he's like, oh no, woe is me, because an axe head was really valuable, and we do not have the money to replace that. Oh no, the responsibility was immense. Elisha, through the power of God, made the axe head float so they could retrieve it. It was important enough to God. God would rather perform a miracle than to just say, let it go. It's a prophet, let it go. God's statutes do matter. If it was hired, verse 15, if the owner was with it, he shall not make it good. If it was hired, it came for his hire. In other words, I'll come over and do it for you. I'll charge you $100 and I'll rototill your field for you. Okay, if I bring my rototiller over to rototill your garden for you and I'm going to charge you $100 and it breaks down while I'm over there rototilling it, or if you come and pick it up and you say, hey, I'll give you $50 if you let me use your rototiller for the couple of days, then fine, here's $50, take my rototiller. Then if it breaks down, hey, you're free. Don't worry about it. I rented it out to you. It's my responsibility. That was the thing. I made the deal with you. It's part of the hire. I was compensated out of the $50. How many times could I rent it out before it finally breaks down? Rental companies, rental yards make their living doing this. Now that's legal and that's fine within God's law. But if you're going to just borrow it for free, whether the owner's there or not, if it's just a freebie thing, then you have a responsibility unless the owner says, no, I'll run it and I'm going to hold you free of it. If the owner was with it, he would not make it good because it was hired. But if he's not there, that's different. Verse 16, if a man entices a virgin who is not a betrothed. Now this is a virgin who was enticed, like the slick words, and they kept talking and talking and talking her into it until finally this woman gives in. He entices her, and he lies with her. He shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. Well, maybe she doesn't want to marry him. Maybe he doesn't want to marry her. That doesn't change the fact that you have to pay the bride price. Take her to be your wife. Be a man. Step up to the plate and do it right. But if the father says, you know what, that's going to end up that this guy is just a loser and she got sucked in by a loser. I don't want to see her messing up her life. I'm not going to let that happen. If the father was dead, then the responsibility would fall to the eldest brother. Or it could fall to the mother in today's culture. But historically, it fell to the eldest brother. The father refuses, then he still paid the money according to the bride price of virgins. You still paid the dowry. That's the price. Now, this is because he was, kind of schemed his way in, but this gal was not betrothed. She was not married. It wasn't adultery. It was fornication. And the penalty for adultery was far more serious than the penalty for fornication. So in this case, fornication with someone who was a virgin was you had to pay the dowry. And you can go back and see what that price would be because it talks about it back in Deuteronomy, I think, chapter 22. At any rate, it ends up being the shekels of silver in today's value according. It talks in the book of Judges about what a shekel was equal to, like about a day's wages, $150, $200, 50 shekels times that. It was approximately $10,000. You'd have to pay about 10 grand. That's the price. That's the price for enticing a virgin into bed. If you don't marry her, or if you do marry her, you still pay the father and the mother about 10 grand. It wasn't the death penalty because the woman had guilt too. She should have known better than getting talked into something like that. She sinned as well. But he had to pay the price of, the least amount would be like $7,500 to $10,000 according to the value of silver at the time and a day's wage at the time. About 10 grand. So the father refuses, doesn't change. He still has to pay the bride price of virgins. You men out there that know what you've done, this is the law. This is the law, or know what you're about to do or try to do. This is God's law. Now, you know. Verse 18, you shall not permit a sorceress to live. Well, the judges made that determination. It wasn't ever up to an individual to try to enforce. This was a national law for the nation of Israel when they were a national people, and the judges would make this determination. This is something that we cannot apply on our own. Just want to really be abundantly clear on that. No one ever had the eye for an eye. It was never carried out by an individual. It was always done by the judges. Whoever lies with a beast shall surely be put to death. That would be carried out by the judges as a national. We don't have laws. We don't have a nation where we can carry out these laws today. At the restoration of all things, that will be different. He who sacrifices to any god except the eternal, he will be utterly destroyed. God will do the destroying. We don't need to take the vengeance ourselves. You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress a stranger. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You know, it's very, very important when we have a new person moves into town that, or a stranger, or maybe somebody in certain areas where maybe you have certain ethnic majorities and somebody who's an ethnic minority, take special care to make sure you don't mistreat them. Show them respect. Show them love. Remember, you were strangers in Egypt. You were wandering in somebody else's country. You were the odd guy. You were the weirdo. And Jews to this day are called what? The peculiar people. We are a peculiar people. And then, of course, being Messianic Jews makes you double peculiar because you're even peculiar to Jews. You're peculiar to the Gentiles for being Jewish, and you're peculiar to the Jews for accepting Yeshua. You got the double. Do not mistreat strangers. Show them respect. Show them love. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall not afflict any widow or any fatherless child. Be careful the way you do business with widows or fatherless children. Do not afflict them. Do not mistreat them. Be careful. If you afflict them in any way and they cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will become hot against you, and I'll kill you with the sword, and your wives will be widows, and your children will be fatherless. I was a fatherless child. My dad died when I was just a little boy. And I saw this happen. God became my father, and he watched out for me. And he protected me many, many times from men that were threatening me and from companies that were threatening me. And I cried out to God, and he has always been there for me, and he'll always be there for you. That is a testimony. If you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like the moneylender to him. You shall not charge him interest. You can charge interest to somebody who's not poor. It specifically says the poor. It doesn't say you can't charge interest any time ever. You make a business deal. Okay, I'll make this investment. I'd like to get a return on my investment. If I put it to the bank, Messiah said I'd at least get interest. So Messiah was not against getting interest. He says, he told the man who buried it in a napkin, buried his talent in a napkin, you should have at least put it to the money changers, or at least put it in the bank where I get interest, right? He's not against getting interest. There are institutions designed for that, people that have money that want to invest in high risk this or that or what have you, and they want to get a return on investment, that's okay. But if somebody who's poor says, man, I can't pay my rent, I'm going to get kicked out, I don't have enough food to eat, you say, I'll loan you $1,000, it's 10% interest. You are evil. You're an evil person if you do that. That is wrong to charge interest for the poor. If somebody wants to do a money deal as a business thing, and it's not a matter of being poor, that's different. You shall not be like a money lender to him. You shall not charge him interest. It's a violation of Torah. If you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, because they would take security, you know, I'll take this as collateral. So collateral was common. You can take things for collateral, and that was okay. But be careful what you decide to take as collateral. So sometimes people would take things as collateral that would be the most important things. That way they would be assured of getting their money back, or who cares if I don't, the collateral's worth more than what you owe. And that would be the way, you know, somebody would think. So if you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, be sure to return the pledge before the sun goes down. No, it's going to be a short-lived pledge, because when it's time to go to sleep and he's cold at night because you took his source of heat, you took his source of comfort and the things that he needs. It's a garment for his skin. What's he going to sleep in? He's going to cry to me because I'm gracious. And then you aren't being gracious. That puts you in a bad spot. You don't want to be at cross purposes with God. I don't want to be at cross purposes with God. The principle of this law is applied in a number of ways. You know, it's like everybody's got to have, I got to have my blankets at night. You can't take my bed. It's like, okay, until you pay me back, I'm taking your bed and your blankets. Well, what are we going to sleep in? Well, until you pay me back, I'm going to take all your food. Well, what are we going to eat? Until you pay me back, I'm going to take your house and kick you out of it. Well, what are we going to live? Till you pay me back, I'm going to take your tools. Well, I'm a mechanic. I can't make a living without my tools. How am I going to pay you back? I'm taking your Snap-on roll-away toolbox. That's wrong. Take something that isn't absolutely required for them to survive if you want to take something as collateral. Otherwise, it's considered wickedness to the eternal. This is God's law. This is the wisdom in our heritage from our Father, the God of love. Everything we need to do, everything we do needs to be done from love, with concern and compassion and empathy and love and graciousness. And you can get some collateral. But don't be so worried about not getting paid back that you actually start to mistreat people or show people disrespect. It's not right. People are more important than getting paid back. And that's the thing we need to understand. People are more important. So be careful what pledge you take. If they cry out to God, you might be in real danger. You could have disasters come upon your business and your finances, and you could end up needing to borrow. And then you'd borrow from somebody who would treat you the same way you treat others. Ask yourself, do I want to be treated the way I treat others? Ask yourself. You shall not revile God. And I say ask yourself. I'm asking myself, believe me, I don't exclude myself. We need to all do that. I make many mistakes. I look at this and I ask myself. I ask myself constantly. I'm no exception. So pardon my language. You shall not revile God nor curse the ruler of your people. And we have New Testament applications of these statutes all over. Here's one that I'll just share with you. You shall not revile God nor curse a ruler of your people. But it's such a common thing to curse the ruler of your people today. You know, people will go on and on about the president or the congressman or this judge or whoever, and just revile them and rake them over the coals. And as a matter of fact, whole talk show programs, the most biggest and popular ones, they just make millions of dollars off of just berating and berating and berating. And they make a lot of good points. They make a lot of good points. That's not the point. If they make a good point, it's not the point. But it's true. Well, if they're telling the truth, isn't the point either. You know, if somebody commits a sin, is it really helpful or appropriate that you expose their sin to everyone? Maybe. In certain circumstances, it might be. Like, for example, maybe, I don't know, pedophile or something, you might want to protect your children, right? Okay, I understand, but normally, if you try to expose other people's faults, especially if you're trying to just berate the rulers of your people, to revile them, it's a violation of the statute of God. Love covers, right? That is not loving. God's law is love. Therefore, this is a sin to do that. Because love covers. Love isn't trying to expose everybody's faults. What if it's true? Well, doesn't matter. I mean, I make mistakes. Do I want everybody to know every mistake? Do you want everybody to know every mistake you made? Of course not. In Acts chapter 23, and verse 2, let me show you something here. This is pretty cool. Because I love to show people God's statutes being applied in the Brit Hadashah era, or the New Testament era. Acts chapter 23, verse 2. Paul was looking out at the brethren and said, I haven't lied. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by to strike Paul on the mouth, strike him on the mouth. And Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to Torah, and then do you command me to be struck contrary to Torah? And then those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? So this is an example of reviling, because we just said, you shall not revile the ruler of your people. So when Paul said this, then Paul answered, verse 5, and said, I didn't know, brethren, that he was the high priest. I didn't know. Sorry. I didn't realize. Because it does say, you shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people. He quoted that statute. Paul knew he was wrong. Okay. Can we do that? Can we control our tongue? Can we say, I'm really angry about the president, the congressman, the governor, this or that, but do you really want to rant against them? Even if they were so wicked as Satan, didn't it say, Michael, right, did not dare bring a railing accusation against Satan, but simply said, the eternal rebuke you. Something for us to consider. That's for sure. Okay, you shall not curse, revile God, or curse the ruler of your people. Then it gets into some more beautiful things here. I think I'll just stop right there. Next time we pick it up, we'll pick it up, God willing, at verse 29 there. And then we'll get into Exodus 23, and it gets into some really beautiful things concerning the land rest. 6 years you shall sow, and the 7th year is the land rest, and et cetera. And that's a very important passage to cover right now. So I'm going to probably speak on this and continue this very soon, because we are coming up to the 7-year land rest cycle very soon now. This year, coming up between the Feast of First Fruits and, trumpets and Yom Kippur. And so, anyway, we'll share with you some of the laws about that as we go forward next time. But remember, in Deuteronomy 4, God said, these statutes, these testimonies, these laws, these instructions, these principles, these oracles of God, the precepts of God, they are our heritage. They are our wisdom. They make us smarter than other people. Not to be superior over anyone, but it does make you a better businessman. It makes you a better wife, a better husband, a better dad, a better son, and a better daughter. And it makes you wiser than the nations around you. David said God's statutes made him wiser than his teachers and wiser than the aged ones. You want to be smart? Study Torah.